Hello everyone, it's the Motorcycle Muse here, and in this video I'm going to explain how a motorcycle clutch works. So it's just this component here. I'm going to explain how that works. I'm then going to disassemble the actual clutch so that you can see all the various components close up, and it will allow me to explain in more detail how those components work together to drive the motorcycle. And then finally in this video I'm going to explain how you inspect the various components for wear or damage, and which components you might have to replace, and what little problems you might have to look out for on the clutch of your own motorcycle engine. So what is the role of the clutch in the motorcycle engine? Well, before we talk about how the clutch actually works and what its role is, we need to understand a couple of things. Firstly, we need to look at the different shafts that are running through the motorcycle engine. So the first shaft that I want to look at is the crankshaft. So the crankshaft is the shaft that is connected to the piston that sits in the cylinder, and as the piston's going up and down, it's driving the crankshaft constantly. So when the motorcycle is running, the crankshaft is turning constantly. And on the end of the crankshaft, there is this little primary drive gear, okay? And it acts on this primary driven gear, which is connected to the clutch pack assembly. So when the engine is running constantly, it causes the clutch pack to rotate constantly as well. Now the clutch pack, or the clutch, is on the end of the second shaft that we need to know about, which is called the input shaft. So the input shaft runs through the motorcycle engine. So in normal circumstances, both the crankshaft and the input shaft are rotating constantly. Now, the input shaft acts on a third shaft called the output shaft, and the output shaft again is another shaft that runs through the center of the motorcycle engine, and on the end of the output shaft is the rear or the front sprocket, which drives the chain, which is connected to the rear wheel of our motorcycle. So there's times when we don't want this turning. For example, when we're changing gear, we don't want this turning. When we want to start a motorcycle for the first time in the morning, before we head off on our journey, we don't want this. We don't want to turn the key and then next thing the front sprocket starts turning straight away, and then we lose control of the motorcycle. So we want this to be not turning in that situation. And we also, when we're in motion and we want to come to a stop, we want to be able to disengage the rest of the engine from this front sprocket, so that we can again come to a stop. So the role essentially of the clutch is to disengage the input shaft from the output shaft. So how do we do that? So essentially the way we do that is we pull with our left hand on the motorcycle, on the handlebar, we pull the clutch lever, okay, with our left hand. So we pull the clutch lever, and that acts on this little actuating arm which is on the clutch cover. So the clutch cover in normal circumstances is sitting in here on the engine, and we pull on the clutch lever, and it actually has a wire that is a cable which is connected to this actuating arm, and it pulls this actuating arm, okay? So this actuating arm, just see it a little bit easier on the other side, the actuating arm has a little shaft that runs into underneath the cover, and when we pull on that shaft, it rotates the shaft. And on the end of the shaft we have this little part here, this little arm. So this little arm acts on, when it's placed securely on the engine of the motorcycle, it acts on this little push rod. And this little push rod will be pushed inwards. Now it's really stiff, it takes quite a bit of force to actually move it. But in normal circumstances, so let me just turn it a little bit this way. So when that actuating arm pushes on this push rod, like so, and that essentially disengages the clutch. So it takes the pressure off these little plates that are in the clutch plaque assembly, and it causes the input shaft to be disengaged or to stop rotating. So the input shaft will stop rotating as a result of this pressure being put on this little push rod. Okay, so let's just start to disassemble the clutch so that we can kind of take a better look at the parts in the clutch, and I'll be able to describe better how it works. So the first thing I need to do is I'm just going to remove this push rod. Now I want to remove this lifting plate first of all, which is just this square metal plate with a bearing in the middle of it, and it's held on with 4 bolts which are called the clutch spring bolts. So I have already loosened these bolts. They are torqued on to a specific value. So I have loosened them already, and I'm just going to loosen them out the rest of the way. So you try and do it as evenly as you can to not put too much pressure on any of the springs. And the bolts are essentially keeping the pressure on the springs, the clutch springs. So I'll just remove this one fully. Okay, and with those bolts out, I can now remove the plate. Okay, so this is just a little holder that the push rod slots into, and it's for maintaining the pressure. So there's no hole on this end of it, it's just a little housing for the push rod, and it fits in through this little bearing here in the middle, and it applies pressure on the bearing essentially. So when the actuating arm pushes on the push rod, the push rod housing acts on the bearing, which is secured inside this little square piece of metal, this little plate. So essentially it puts pressure on the plate. So I'll leave that down for the moment. So I can now remove the springs. So these springs are there to keep pressure on the plates. So let me just remove them. Again, I'll try and keep them in order. Okay. And with that, I can now see the clutch center, which is this unit here. Okay. And I can also see the pressure plate, the front of the pressure plate. So let me just take this all out so you can see it further before I start explaining any more. So the clutch plates are held in this case with a little snap ring. So I have a little snap ring pliers which I'm going to use to take off this snap ring, which is securing all the plates inside. So there's my little snap ring. Okay, so I just go in that way. Okay, so on most clutches in motorcycle engines, there won't be a snap ring, there will actually be a center bolt, or a center nut, sorry. So there will be a center nut securing the clutch plates assembly securely to the input shaft. So I'm going to pull out all the plates as an assembly, as one unit, and we're going to take a look. There might be some markings on some clutches, so there might be a marking, which there isn't on this one, but there can be some markings which indicate, there might be a little marking here on the clutch center, and then there might be a corresponding marking on the pressure plate, which is on the back. So let's take a look at this assembly now that we have it out. So I'm just going to turn it upside down so that you can kind of see it a little bit better. So on top here we have the pressure plate. So I can take that out. That's the pressure plate. Okay. Next up, we can pull off the first of the friction plates. So that's the friction plate. Next we're going to have a plain plate, which we pull off. That's followed by another friction plate, and actually another plain plate. So let's put them back on. Another friction plate, another plain plate, another friction plate, another plain plate, a friction plate, and then another plain plate, and then lastly one more friction plate. Okay, and then at the bottom we have our clutch center. So that's the clutch center. So what I've done here is I've reassembled the friction plates and the plain plates back onto the clutch center along with the pressure plate, and I just want to talk about this unit for a second. So let's understand how this particular unit works, because this is the key to how clutch works. So the first thing I want to note is that the friction plates are the ones with the teeth. So you can see that these little splines, I suppose you could call them, or little teeth, are sticking up the whole way around. So all the friction plates have teeth on the outside, and the teeth on the outside of the friction plates correspond or gel with or catch in the clutch basket or the clutch itself. So if we take off a friction plate, we'll see that. So the teeth on the friction plate gel perfectly with the clutch basket. And that means that the friction plates always turn with the clutch basket. So if the clutch basket is turning, those friction plates have no option but to turn with it. And the second thing I want to note is on the clutch center. So this unit here, and this is the other side of the far side of the clutch center. On the clutch center we have little teeth as well, the whole way around the outside. And the teeth on the clutch center so the teeth on the clutch center gel with the teeth that are on the inside of the plane plates. So all the plane plates have teeth on the inside, whereas all the friction plates have teeth on the outside. So the teeth on the inside of the plane plates gel with the clutch center, and they also gel with the teeth on, or also what gels with the teeth on the clutch center are the teeth on the pressure plate. So the pressure plate and the plane plates always turn with the clutch center. So if the clutch center is turning, then the pressure plate and the plane plates are turning with it. And what we also need to note is that there is splines on the input shaft, and there is corresponding splines on the clutch center. So that means that if the clutch center is rotating, it brings the input shaft with it. So it's the clutch center along with the plane plates and the pressure plate that turn or make the input shaft turn. And we can also note that the friction plates, if you just notice it here, the friction plates rotate independently of the plane plates, the clutch center and the pressure plate. So you can see that there now. So I can move all those plates essentially. So I can just barely moving them there, but you can just about see it. So the plates will move, I'll move two of them. You can see that I can move two plates together. Two friction plates will turn independent of the clutch center and the plane plates. Okay, but if I apply pressure, so if I hold these really tight, so I hold this whole unit like this, really a firm grip, and I try to turn those pressure plates, or those friction plates, sorry, they will not move. Okay, so that's what we need to note. When there is no pressure on this clutch pack, the friction plates will rotate independently of all the plane plates. But if there's pressure on the unit, then if I try to move the friction plates, the whole unit turns with it. And that is the key to how a clutch works. So how do we control whether there is pressure on this unit, this clutch pack, or not? Well, the pressure on the clutch pack is controlled via the springs and via the lifting plate. So with the springs applied, I'll put them all back on here. With the springs applied, I tighten up all those bolts. The lifting plate, along with the the springs, create a force on the pressure plate. So they basically pull the pressure plate this way. So the pressure plate, we can see these bolt holes here. They're connected to the pressure plate. I'll take it back off. So the bolts are secured in here. The springs are sitting on the clutch center. And when they're compressed via the bolts and the lifting plate, they are trying to push outwards. So the spring is compressed and it's trying to push that way. So essentially, the springs create a force which locks the plates together. So in normal circumstances, the plates are all held tightly together via the clutch springs and the lifting center, or the lifting plate. And that means that if the clutch basket is turning, which it will be when the engine is running, then it will cause the input shaft, which is connected to this unit via the splines, it will cause it to turn as well. So the input shaft will always be turning under normal circumstances, and if we want to stop the input shaft from turning, all we have to do is release that pressure. So the pressure, if we don't have that huge pressure on the plates, the plate pack, the clutch pack, then they will not rotate together. So if we release that pressure on the pack, then the friction plates will rotate independent of the other plates and the rest of the clutch pack. So how do we release that pressure on the springs? So this is where the pressure plate, or the lifting plate comes in. So the lifting plate, which is connected to the springs, can be acted on via the little push rod which we described earlier. So when we pull on the clutch lever, it pulls through. The clutch lever is connected usually via a cable to the actuating arm on the clutch on the outside of the engine, and the actuating arm pushes on this little push rod. So the actuating arm, the push rod is pushed by the actuating arm. It's going to be sitting here and it's going to be pushed inwards like this. So that's what it's going to be pushed out in normal circumstances via the springs, and when we push on it like this by the actuating arm and the clutch cable, or the clutch in our left hand, we actually push this little lifting plate, and it pushes on the springs and it reduces the pressure that the springs create, and it means that all of a sudden there's no pressure on the pack and the friction plates can rotate independently, or when they do rotate, they will not bring the rest of the clutch pack, they will not bring the clutch center and the lifting plate with it. And consequently, the input shaft will stop rotating. So we're able to disconnect the input shaft from the crankshaft by just pulling the clutch lever, which acts on the push rod, which acts on the springs, which reduces the pressure on the clutch pack. And that essentially is how a clutch works. So then lastly, I just wanted to show you, I just want to take out the clutch pack. So the clutch pack, there's a little thrust washer, which is just, it fits over the splines, fits in along the splines once you get it matched up, and it secures on the clutch pack, or the clutch basket. So we take off this little thrust washer and we can actually just pull the clutch basket straight off. There we can see the primary driven gear that is just permanently connected to the clutch basket. It cannot be removed. You'd probably have to drill those little holes, or drill those little sealed bolts, I suppose, to remove the primary driven gear from the clutch basket. If anything was damaged here, you would probably have to replace the clutch basket, this whole unit as one. Okay, and there we have our input shaft. And we can see that on the input shaft there is another splined, smaller splined shaft, which is able to rotate independently of the input shaft. So if I just put a little bit of pressure there, it just spins in independently. So this is what the clutch basket sits on, this little smaller shaft. And this is our input shaft on which the clutch pack sits and rotates with it.